Having done it about a dozen times in both directions, I have to say it is one of the most wonderful experiences that you can have with a boat. I've just always enjoyed it enormously. Although we talk about the French canals, that's only 1/3 of the passage through France. The northern part is Canals, the middle part is the River Saône, and the final part, third part, is the Rhône. The Saône and the Rhône are major commercial waterways. They have giant barges on there that are capable of carrying the equivalent of 85 lorry loads, cruise liners that will carry hundreds and hundreds of passengers on cruises. The canal part is mainly, it slightly depends what route you take, but if you take the most popular route, which is from Le Havre up the River Seine up to Rouen, then through Paris, and then down the canal system. If you take that route, most of it is fairly quiet. There are barges, but they're much smaller. They're probably only 100 foot. They carry the same draft as a sailing yacht, so they will be running down the centre of the canals, and the guys driving them won't always understand that we've got 1.50 meters of keel underneath us and we can't get to the side of the canal. So it's sometimes a little bit challenging as you move over and dig into soft mud with your keel. There are 3 main entrances into the canal system from the English Channel. There's one at Calais, which, as we all know, is a major ferry port with hundreds and hundreds of ferries going in and out every day. There's one at Saint-Valery-sur-Somme, which is challenging because Saint-Valery is very tidal, it has huge mud flats outside it, so in order to be able to get into Saint-Valery in the first place, you need to find the marker buoy, the channel buoy, which is outside. You need to be there about an hour and a half after low water, and then you need to carry the tide through a constantly changing channel into Saint-Valery. The channel's marked, I mean they move the buoys around, but your plotter's absolutely useless because the channel changes after every gale. It doesn't change annually, it changes after every gale. And the third entrance is from Le Havre or Honfleur, which is the mouth of the River Seine, and you carry the river up to Rouen, where you can take your mast down. Again, with Le Havre, a bit like Saint-Valery, you need to plan your departure into the River Seine a couple of hours before low water, so you're pushing the last bit of the tide at the beginning of your passage up the river, and you will then carry the tide for most of the way up. There's only a couple of possible stopping places between the mouth of the Seine and Rouen, so you need to work out your tides and you need to time it right, otherwise you're going to have a problem. There is a fourth entry into the Canal du Midi, which is down Bordeaux, which requires from the UK a reasonably long passage from UK waters down to La Rochelle or Royan. At Royan you get into the Gironde, and the Gironde is the river that the Cockleshell heroes paddled up in order to get to Bordeaux. And in Bordeaux there's a DIY crane where you can pay 50, 60, 70 euros and borrow the crane for an hour to get your mast down, or there's a couple of boat yards in the river that will do it for you, or will have a man there to help you with the craning. The Canal du Midi has its own very special problems in as much as it's a very shallow canal, and I'll talk more about that later. The distance from Le Havre on the English Channel down to Port Napoleon on the Mediterranean is 823 miles. I've done the trip in less than 2 weeks, but that's pretty hard work. I think normally you would expect to spend 3 or 4 weeks doing it, or maybe even the entire summer. There are physical aspects of the French canals, which it's quite important to know about before you think about making the route. The maximum length of boat that you can have is 124 foot. Well, you know, that's not really going to affect any of us. However, the maximum beam in a lock is 5 meters. And that 5 meters is absolute. It includes your fenders, it includes the protection board, and if you're in a catamaran, and I've done it once in a catamaran, and it's not easy, if you're anywhere approaching 5 meters, 16 foot 4 inches beam, you've got a problem. And you must do your measurement, including fenders on both sides, because you need fendering on both sides. The draft of the canals is not quite so much of a problem. The draft is officially 1 meter 80, that's 5 foot 9 inches, and the bottom is soft mud. And the commercial barges regularly exceed that depth. In the centre of the canals, in the centre of the normal canals, you will find a depth of 5 foot 9, 6 foot. With a soft bottom, you will run aground occasionally if you're anywhere near that draft, but basically you're going to be fine. The height of the canals is a maximum of 3.5 meters, that's 11 foot 4 inches. This height is controlled by the bridges, and it's absolutely an absolute. If particularly for motorboats, this is a problem. If you are in excess from your waterline to the top structure, whatever that is, of more than 11 foot 4 inches, you're not going to get underneath the bridges. In fact, if you're a little bit less than that, if there's been flooding, if there's been a problem, you're going to crunch the bottom of the bridge. There are ways around it. One of the ways is to speak to the lock keepers, and the lock keepers can lower the height of the water to some extent by a few inches, a foot or so maybe, in certain places. Or you can get stacks and stacks of barrels, fill them up with water, and reduce the height of your boat. But the height is 11 foot 4 inches. The Canal du Midi is a different ballpark altogether. The Canal du Midi, the length is 98 foot. Okay, that's fine. The beam is 5 foot 5, which is more or less the same as the canals in the more general part, and that shouldn't be a problem. The draft of the Canal du Midi is theoretically 1 meter 60. That's 5 foot 2 inches. And differently from the canals, the Canal du Midi is carved out of rock. So if you go aground in the Canal du Midi, you're going to go really solidly aground. There's no soft mud down there. It is hard rock, and you're stuck. The fact they say it's 1 meter 60 is an ambition in some places. The canal is fed by huge reservoirs which are built up in the hills, and those reservoirs depend on rainfall, and they depend on the rainfall to fill the canal. So as the water in the canal is used, the reservoirs pump water down into the canal. In a dry summer, there is frequently much less than 1 meter 60. It's not a given. So if you're anywhere near that draft, I really don't recommend that you use the Canal du Midi. There's also a problem with air height. Theoretically, there's 3 meters 30 is the height of the bridges, but the bridges are curved, they're arched. So in the middle, at the top of the arch, yes, there's 3 meters 30, but where the arch starts, where it begins to curve in, it's at 2 meters 40. So if you, again, moboats can have a problem here, that if you're a very square boat and you've got stuff on top, 2 meters 40 is all you've got. 225 is probably the limit that you should be trying it at. Right, having decided that your boat is physically of the right dimensions to get through the canals, you're going to want some paperwork. First of all, you need to have passports. Clearly, you've got to have a passport, a valid passport from a member of the crew, and a dog's passport or a cat's passport or whatever if you've got an animal on board. You need the ship's registration papers. That can be the small ship's register or part 1 or whatever, but you need ship's registration papers. You're almost certainly going to be asked at some point for an insurance certificate. If you go into any marina in France, if you go anywhere like that, one of the papers they want to see is a certificate of insurance. You're also theoretically meant to be carrying a paper showing that you are qualified to drive the boat. This is a slight anomaly in British law that in Britain you don't need any paperwork to drive a boat, so you don't need any paperwork to show. There is a paper called the ICC, the International Certificate of Competence, which in Britain is issued by the RYA, in other countries it's issued by other organisations. I've never, ever been asked for my ICC. Not in all the years I've been sailing, nobody has ever asked me. But I guess if you were involved in an accident or had a problem, they might want some form, the authorities might ask for some form of qualification. So an ICC could. Along with the ICC, you need the SEVNI, which is the RYA course, and it is just a 20 question paper that you, or 10 question paper even, that you fill out. The SEVNI shows that you know what the rules and regulations are for travelling in the French canals. Again, I have never, ever been asked for this paper or asked for my ICC, which contains my SEVNI. The one thing they will ask you for, however, without a doubt, and in quite a lot of locks they're going to ask you for it, is your vignette. Now, the vignette is the tax you pay to the French government in order to use their waterways. You go to a website and fill in an online form giving the details of your boat, and you can buy a vignette for the amount of time that you think you're going to spend in the canals. You can buy a vignette for a week, a month, or a couple of months, or 3 months, or whatever. Absolutely essential that you have that vignette from the moment that you enter the French waterways. Get it online, print it out, and stick it in a window of the boat so that the lock keepers can see it. You're going to be asked for that. It's the one thing they want. Probably you need to work out how to do your engine checks. Obviously you're going to check the oil occasionally, that's a given, but the water filters are going to get filled up with debris from the canals. There's a lot of stuff floating about there. This is particularly true if you do use the Calais route or the Saint Valery route. Those canals have got a lot of stuff like leaves and twigs and weeds and stuff floating around in them, and your water filters are going to get blocked up, and you need to know how to unblock your water filter. You need to know that you can take the, if necessary, you can take the Jubilee clip off the fitting that goes through the hull, be able to close the valve, take the rubber tube off, open the valve, and poke a stick through it so to clear any debris that may have been stuck on the outside. Lastly, you're going to need guides. You're going to need stuff like this. This is the Fluviacart guide for going up the Seine, going up the river to Rhône, and it takes you virtually as far as Paris. There are 6 of these guides for the main route between Le Havre and Port Napoleon in the Mediterranean, or set in the Mediterranean. You could just do it without those guides if you use this number 21 Fluvia cart, but the guides add an awful lot to it. The Fluvia cart, yes, it does show the locks, yes, it does show some fuel places, but really and truly you need to invest in the guides. You can get them on the internet. This is my book, French Canal Routes to the Mediterranean. It does contain obviously more information than there is in these videos. It's got all the details written down and it looks in more detail at the routes. I guess with this book and Fluvia cart you could just about do it on that, but frankly I think you need more than that. I think you should buy I really do think you should buy the Fluvia carts and do it properly. The one thing your boat is really going to need is fenders. You need as many fenders as you can possibly get. The canal locks are very unforgiving. Some of them has only got shuttering in them, and all of them are concrete. They've all got concrete sides, and you really do not want to be rubbing your fiberglass against those concrete sides. So you can't have enough fenders down the side. A way of augmenting the fenders and making it even better is to have scaffold planks and drill a couple of holes in them and hang scaffold planks on each side of your boat above the fenders, so it's the scaffold planks that take the punishment. It can knock hell out of the fenders. Motor car tyres are illegal unless you have to use as fenders, unless you have two lines attached to them. They are going to put black marks on your hull, and the only way around that is to cover them in lots and lots of bin bags and gaffer tape it all up. They are a solution if push comes to shove. The scaffold planks, by the way, are also useful for getting ashore. There's going to be times with the draft that you're not going to be able to get the boat properly into the canal bank to park up for the night. So what you're going to do is push the bows in and put a line ashore on the bows, leave the stern sticking out because the keel won't let you get properly alongside. And so the scaffold plank is a really useful way of being able to run down from the bows onto the canal bank. The other thing you're going to want is to support the mast that you've taken down. The easiest way to do it is with a cruciform of wood, probably 3x3 minimum. 2x2 is a bit light, 3x3, 4x4. And the easiest way to do it is to buy sufficient lengths to keep the mast off your deck on the bows, and obviously much higher ones in the stern, and drill a hole, and take an electric drill, and when you're doing it, drill a hole through the center of each support and put a bolt with washers. Not even stainless, it can just be galvanized, you're going to throw it away. Put a bolt with washers through them, and then you can keep the mast possibly supported by the sail bags on the coach roof on the top of your boat so that you can get underneath it. The alternative to this is that when you take the mast down, you totally undress it, you take the shrouds off, you take the light off the top, you take the VHF antenna off the top, you take everything off the top, and you wrap it up in plastic, not putting gaffer tape on the mast itself, because that will leave horrible marks, and you call a company who will pick the mast up in Rouen, for example, and they will take it all the way to Port Napoleon, where you can have the mast put back up and redressed. The cost of craning the mast in and out of your boat will vary from around 60 or 70 euros with a DIY crane like the one in Bordeaux, or if you pay a yacht club or a commercial company to do it, you're probably looking at 150 to 200 euros for the use of their crane and for them getting it ashore so that you can secure all the shrouds and fenders and things. In my book, I give you sort of full instructions on how to get the mast down and the order to do it in. It's not difficult, but it does need preparation. And when you arrive at the crane, particularly if it's a commercial crane, you do need to have the shrouds all loose. You need to have everything loose and ready. So that all you've got to do is take a few pins out and release the mast so that they can crane it off. You're going to need a supply of split pins, cotter pins, split pins, and I personally would take all the bottle screws off the end of the shrouds and put them in a separate bag, because vibration can make them come loose, and if they fall in the water it's jolly expensive. It's worth taking all the bottle screws off. Fuel. In the French canal system, yes, there are some marinas selling fuel, but they are few and far between, and you may well find yourself in a situation where you need to go to a petrol station, a normal motorcar petrol station, fuel station, to get fuel, to get diesel. Therefore, you need to have a couple of jerry jugs that you can reasonably lift when they're full out. The other thing to talk about is gas. Cala gas is an absolute no-no. You cannot. It is virtually impossible to get your Cala gas cylinders refilled, and they don't supply exchange cylinders or anything like that. Before you set out, you really need to convert to camping gas. If you go to the Cala gas website, you'll find there is a system for converting, and frankly I wouldn't even bother to bring the Cala gas cylinders with me. I would buy a couple of camping gas cylinders and keep them on board, and they will do for the whole of the canal trip and all your time in the Mediterranean, which is the same. You can't get Cala gas in the Mediterranean. You need to have camping gas, so you need to do the conversion before you leave the UK. Mooring. At the end of the day, in the canal system, not so much the rivers, but in the canal system, you're going to moor up mainly to the bank. You will hardly ever go in a marina. The marinas aren't even dredged normally for our sort of craft. So you're going to moor up to the bank, and that's absolutely fine. You can moor to the bank. Normally alongside the bank there is a towpath, and the towpath is wide enough for a bicycle or a moped or something like that. What you are not allowed to do is run your mooring lines across the towpath to a convenient fence or tree on the other side, because people come whizzing up and down those towpaths on their mopeds, particularly the lock keepers and bicyclists, and they will not be amused by going arse over tit as they hit your mooring lines. You'll probably only have to use them a couple of times, but you do need 2 stakes and a mallet to hammer them in with. Water is available in the canals at virtually every single lock. When you go into the lock, if you're running low on water, if you go into the lock, just ask the lock keeper, and he'll probably supply the hose pipe himself. If not, you've got your own, I'm sure, but you can fill up with water in all the locks. There are 3 main entry points into the system from the UK. From Dover to Calais, and then Calais into the canal system, has got some attractions. When you go into Calais, you need to be very careful. You need to use channel VHF 12, contact port control, and wait for instructions to be allowed in. Having got in, you then must go to the Calais Marina, which is a lock-in job. Obviously, if you get there at high water, you can get in easily. If not, you have to wait for the tide or for the lock to let you in. Inside the marina, there is a travel lift and there is a crane, and the marina shop will organise the taking down of your mast for you and putting it on the deck. Having got yourself demasted and ready, you then need to get into the canal system by going to a lock in Calais harbour called Carnot, and you go into that lock, and that's only available at an hour and a half before high water and an hour after high water. Once you're in the Calais Canal, this has a series of lifting bridges which are controlled by a radar beam, so your boat breaks the radar beam and the bridge lifts for you automatically, and you go on through until you get to the major motorway canal, which is called the Canal du Nord. You hang a right into there and everything changes. This, from being a quiet suburban canal, this is genuinely a major route for barges, big barges. And this canal route, where you will have to wait at locks very often to allow commercial barges to go ahead of you, even though they may be half an hour behind, this major canal route takes you down to the junction with Saint Valery. The actual town of Saint Valery in the marina is absolutely charming. They have an interesting parking situation that their marina, their pontoons are separate from the shore, and they have a fleet of little motorboats with a 2-horsepower engine in the back, and you just use it yourself. It's a DIY tender. You get off your boat, get into one of their little dinghies, fire it up and run it to shore, leave it there, do your shopping or whatever, and when you come back you pick up another one and go back to your boat, which is quite amusing. The Saint Valery Yacht Club will arrange the taking down of your mast and help you set it up on your deck and stow it away. They will then help you organize your transit through the big sea lock, which is only available around high water. You drive into the lock and you just sit in there in the middle of the lock with the motor running until it's adjusted the couple of feet or so that it has to, and you go out the other side, and usefully on the other side, on the right hand side, is a waiting pontoon that you can tie up at and take a breath. Depending on how high you are, you have to inform the bridges ahead of you on this canal that you're coming through, and they will send a lock keeper to each canal bridge, and he will open the bridge for you to let you through all the way until you join the junction with the Canal du Nord. So you join the major motorway route, big barges, quite a lot of tunnels which are interesting, until you get to a place called Noyon. At Noyon you have to make the decision. It really depends whether you want to go through Paris or not. If you want to go through Paris, which is not the logical route, it's further, it adds quite a lot of distance to the journey. You basically hang a right at Noyons and you go down that canal all the way to Conflans, where you join the River Seine, and that takes you through Paris. Alternatively, you hang a left and you get into the Oise and Marne canals, which are going to take you all the way down to the Saône. This is the logical route to use if you are coming out of Saint Valery or Calais, and it's interesting, it's different. It has tunnels, it has flights of locks where a lock keeper will run beside you, or run beside you in a van or on a moped. Very often it's students in summer times doing this, and they will operate each lock gate as you get to it. It's roughly 225 kilometers and 114 locks until you join the Saône at Chalon. The next one further south is Saint Valery-sur-Somme, which is a very attractive place. The canals go through the battlefields of the Somme, so that's quite interesting. And it's slightly inaccessible in as much as you must get to the buoy that marks the entrance outside a couple of hours after low water, so you can carry the tide up because of the mud flats. The way to do that is probably to go to Dieppe, and the route then you can do a 50-60 mile hit from Newhaven to Dieppe, overnight in Dieppe, and then get the next tide to take it the 20 miles from Dieppe to Saint Valery. The Canal du Midi option requires the sea passage from UK waters down the French coast to Royan, which is the mouth of the Gironde River. And in the Gironde River, you're either going to get your mast down there, or you're going to carry on up the river to Bordeaux, to the old submarine pens from World War II, where you lock in, park up in the area in front of these old U-boat pens, and take your mast down. It's a DIY job yourself, and it's probably the most economical way. Having got the mast down, it is a day trip up the river through Bordeaux, under the low bridges, until you get to the sea lock, which gets you into the Canal du Midi. From Bordeaux to Sète, through the Canal du Midi, is 503 kilometers, and there's 139 locks. Sometimes there's a control panel that you use rather than lift poles and that sort of thing. I'm not going to go into great detail about the Canal du Midi because, frankly, it's so shallow, relatively few boats can use it, and it is quite special in as much as it only goes halfway of the trip from the Mediterranean to France, or indeed from the UK to the Mediterranean. It's useful for shallow draft boats, it's useful for some motor boats, and it's worth looking at. There are more details in my book about it. It is pretty, it is charming, it's very touristic, it's full of hire boats, self-drive motor cruisers as big as your boat, which, for reasons that are quite beyond me, the drivers require no license, they just need the money to hire a boat with, and off they go. It's a good experience. I've done it twice, I've done it in both directions. It's very pretty. It is probably the prettiest canal system in France, but as I say, it's so limited by its draft and indeed height, air height, that relatively few of us, or relatively few boats of the type we own, will ever be able to go through it. The third route is probably the classic route, the one that most people do, which is from Le Havre or possibly Honfleur, both of which are at the mouth of the River Seine. The access to Le Havre is possibly a problem if you don't want to spend part of a night at sea. So you could go Newhaven-Dieppe, and then from Dieppe go round to Le Havre. It's 30 miles or something, it's not very far. Alternatively, you could go from the Solent across to Cherbourg, which is 60 miles, then from Cherbourg come out of Cherbourg and go to Ouistreham, which you could probably do in one day. The problem with Ouistreham is that the marina there is a lock, so you're slightly committed to the tides, and then out of Ouistreham to Le Havre Honfleur. I keep mentioning the two of them because they both have some attraction, although Le Havre is probably by far the greatest. Le Havre is a proper sea marina. You come in off the dredge channel into Le Havre, and on your left you hang a left and there is the marina in Le Havre, and that marina, which is it's actually a yacht club marina, has got a crane. It's got a 4-ton crane, and you can crane your mast down there. It's about 12 miles from Le Havre Marina to the Honfleur waiting pontoon, or the beginning of the trip up the Seine. If you go to Honfleur, you have to lock in, and it's a very touristy sort of place. It's a very small harbour, very small marina. You can take your mast down there, but it's a hassle. But what is important is that outside Honfleur is a waiting platform. So it would be perfectly possible to come out of Le Havre and go to the waiting pontoon outside Honfleur and wait there for the right moment for the tide. And the right moment for the tide is 2 hours before low water. In my opinion, the best place to get the mast down is Rouen. It's got a proper marina there. It's got a boatyard next door to the marina with a travel lift which is run by the co-op. The cost of lowering the mast is very similar to that of Honfleur or Le Havre. They are a proper professional yard, and they will store your mast, if you want that, to await the arrival of the trailer from the company which will take the mast all the way down to Port Napoleon for you. Alternatively, you can undress the mast beside their crane and then load it onto your boat, onto the wooden structure, so you're all set to go. The passage up the River Seine to Rouen is a bit of a challenge, in as much as you've got to plan it properly to go with the tide. It is 60 miles between Honfleur and Rouen, and with one exception, a place called Saher, which is actually a commercial place for barges, there are no stopping places whatsoever. You simply cannot park up on that route. Strictly speaking, you don't need your vignette until you get to Rouen. Rouen is, the River Seine is considered to be a seaway, so from Le Havre up to Rouen, you don't need to buy the vignette. But from Rouen onwards, you absolutely must have the vignette, and one of the headquarters of the French Waterways organization is in Rouen, so you're not going to get past that. Having got your mast down, you are 40 miles from your first lock, so you still need to use the tide leaving the marina to get yourself up to the first lock. After that first lock, of course, you're in pretty still waters. From the first sea lock to Paris is another 200 kilometers, and there is another sea lock to go through. You must wear your life jackets when you're in manned locks, or they simply won't allow you, they simply won't transit you. Both these locks are run by lock keepers, and it's a fairly normal operation. There are half a dozen possible stopping places after the sea locks, until you get to a place called Conflans. Now, Conflans is really interesting because the canal, the River Seine, divides there. One branch goes up north towards Saint-Valery-sur-Somme and Calais and Belgium, and the other branch goes on into Paris. It is the major barging centre of France for commercial barges. Hundreds and hundreds of commercial barges all parked up around the area. Really interesting place. From Conflans you'll be heading on. There are no more locks, so you'll be heading on up the river into Paris. Really exciting. It's possible to park up underneath the Eiffel Tower, and it's also possible to park up for a longer period of time in the Arsenal on the left-hand side, which is a bit of a liveaboard marina, but nonetheless, if you want to spend a few days in Paris, you can park up there. From this point on, you need the second Fluviacart number 2, La Seine, Amont, Paris, Marseille. Going through Paris, especially around Ile de la Cité, you have to use traffic lights for allowing you through, and you have to keep to your side of the bank or follow the routing that is plainly shown in the Fluviacart. As you leave Paris, the next place you're going to come to is Champagne-sur-Seine. It's about 10 miles, I guess, 10, 12 miles outside Paris. And just after the lock Champagne 2, you will come to a split in the canals where you can hang a right and go down the main route to the Mediterranean, which is in the direction of St. Mams in the Canal de Loing. You're now going to get into proper canal systems, you're going to start encountering automated locks on a regular basis. In fact, the vast majority will be automated. Some of them have got, as you approach them, some of them have got a pole hanging down off a wire which goes across the top of the canal. The pole is normally, it's not actually normally a pole, it's a piece of rubber tubing, and as you pass underneath, you grab the pole, give it a yank downwards, and that signals the lock that you are approaching, and it will either fill up or unfill or do whatever it is it needs to do in order to get ready for you and to open its gates and switch its traffic lights to green. Alternatively to the pole, there are radar beams, and as your boat breaks the radar beam, it signals the lock to prepare itself for your entry, and when the lock is ready for you and the gates are open, the traffic lights will turn to green and you can go in and park up. You need to park up near to the two poles. There's a green pole and a red pole in all these sorts of automatic locks. If you pull the red pole downwards, you create an alarm and a lock keeper leaps on his moped and comes whizzing down the lock to find out what the hell is wrong. If, on the other hand, you lift the green pole, once you're tied up, the gates will automatically close. The lock will either fill or empty, whichever it has to do in order to get you to the next water level, and when that's completed, the lock gates will open and off you go through the lock, and the beam on the way out will be broken and the lock gates will close behind you. Okay, so you're now into the fast route down towards the Mediterranean. The first canal that you're in is 103 kilometers long, and it's got 7 locks. It's called the Canal de Rouen and Canal de Bria. 103 kilometers, 7 locks. You then enter the Canal Lateral de la Loire, and that is 196 kilometers long and has 7 locks. And then finally, well, almost finally, you enter the Canal du Centre, which has 112 kilometers in length and 61 locks. So you can see that the thing that occupies most of the time on your transit of the canals is going through the locks. It's going to take you at least half an hour to get through every lock. You have to wait for the lock to prepare itself, you have to hope it doesn't have to fill up, and you have to hope there aren't boats ahead of you which have just used it. So that is that will get you to a place called Chalon, which is where you enter the River Saône, and it is the end of the canals. I would imagine that you are going to go slowly through the canals and enjoy this couple of 100 kilometers by stopping off in French towns and villages and enjoying each and every vineyard's produce. As you leave the River Seine and enter into the canal system proper, you're entering into the most romantic part of the whole trip, in my opinion. There are 4 or 5 different canals. There are hundreds of locks, and it is a slow passage through the paradise of northern central France. When you look out of the final canal lock at Chalon, you're entering into the Saône, which is a major commercial waterway. It's in fact 142 kilometers of the Saône from Chalon to Lyon. It is a lovely river. It's comparable to the Thames. It has big commercial barges going up and down it, but very, very few locks. And stay on your side of the river. There is a big temptation to cut the bends because the river is so wide. When you can see a bend, there's very often a temptation, or at least I've been tempted, to cut the corner and take the racing route through the bends. big commercial barges are not amused. They're staying on their side of the river, and if you encroach on their side, they will blow their horn at you if not shake their fist. Stopping places are less. You can't just normally you can't just tie up to the bank in the Saône. You need to find stopping places, and these, of course, are all listed in that well-known Navicar number 10, the Saône. Immediately at Châlons, there is a island which is connected by a couple of footbridges, which is just full of restaurants. There's a marina beside it, and if you go, you probably can't get under the first bridge, but if you go just past the little islet and then hang a left and come back in and park up in the marina, there are some lovely street restaurants there, and it's a great way to spend an evening and celebrate the fact that you've done almost half of your trip already. The Saône goes through some wonderful buildings, castles beside it, on its way into Lyon, and the approaches into Lyon I think are absolutely lovely. And when you park up at Lyon, as I did in the Proud Catamaran I did the trip the last time in, under the weeping willows, there is a fuel dock there, there is a waterways office there, and there is the town of Lyon, which actually I like very much indeed. On leaving Lyon, you're going to enter the Rhône River, which is enormous. It has nuclear power stations, it has barrages generating electricity from the tide. It's a serious waterway, major waterway between Lyon and the sea, the Mediterranean Sea. It has a current of around 4 knots, which will be going in your direction, so going down the river is not a problem. The locks are enormous. They take ocean-going ships. They are really serious locks, and when you go into a lock, you're going to tie up to a floating bollard, which normally a ship would tie up with one on each corner. All you can do is to tie up at one fore and aft, and you need to make it really secure because quite a lot of water comes into those locks when they open the shutters. So you tie up really tightly, and this is a time when your plank will come in useful because it's very difficult to keep the boat properly fended off these floating tie-up points that are there within the lock. It is very difficult to park up on the banks of the Rhône. Like going up the Seine earlier, it isn't just a place where you can just pull into the side and park. So I mean, in my book, I list all the 8 parking places. You need to plan each day's trip going, I'm going to get to this parking place, even if it means a short day, because there's nowhere else to go. If you go past that parking place and it's getting dark, you've had it. You've just got to go back to that parking place. From Lyon to Port Napoleon, Port Saint Louis, is 312 kilometers with 12 giant locks, and it's even going downstream is going to take you the best part of 3 or 4 days. It's probably the least attractive part of the whole journey, although the nuclear power stations, the big barrages generating electricity, and the sheer size of the whole thing is impressive, and well, it's awe-inspiring really. There's a couple of good detours. It's worth visiting Avignon, where the famous half bridge is there. It's no longer danced on very often, I think. And there's a place called Arles, which has a French bull ring in it, where they don't do bullfights, but they do something called course landais, where the team jump over smallish bulls that have got balls fixed to the pointed parts of their horns, and they don't kill them, they just play with them. At Arles you have a decision. You can hang a right down a small canal which goes through the countryside, and it's really very pretty with overhanging trees and not madly used, that takes you down into Set. There's one sea lock that you go into where actually you don't have to tie up. The difference in height is only a couple of feet, and you can just motor in the middle, and then it gets you into Set. There are then various bridges and places in Set, and there is a yacht club where you can put your mast back up. Very attractive. You have to wait for a bridge to open, which only happens once or twice a day in order to get into Set. But there's a very nice restaurant beside that railway bridge. Alternatively, you go straight on and you go down the final canal, which will take you to Port Napoleon. You go through the Camargue. Can't really see much of it because there are trees and bushes on either side of the canal, but you're going down through the Camargue, and you eventually get to a lock on your left hand side that you go into, which takes you into Port Saint Louis. From Port Saint Louis you run round the corner, round into Port Napoleon, which is a major marina, major boat yard, all the facilities that you can want, and there you can collect your mast if you left it at Rouen, or you can mast up, and they'll crane the mast on, and you can tighten up your mast and do your electrics and put it all back together again. There are 2 or 3 commercial organizations where if you've got any boat problems, or if you need help getting the radar working again, or whatever electronic equipment working again that was connected to the mast and doesn't work now, there are experts in Port Napoleon. The only down of Port Napoleon is it is in the Camargue, and the Camargue is full of mosquitoes, and you need insect repellent. From Port Napoleon, the Mediterranean is your oyster. At my website, gentlesailing.com, you can find my books about sailing and boats. French Canal Routes to the Mediterranean has sold over 3,000 copies, and the Gentle Sailing Route to the Med, down the Atlantic coast without having to spend a night at sea, has sold over 2,700 copies. The Atlantic Crossing Guide, which I published last year, is being downloaded in amazing numbers, I'm really pleased to say. They're all instant PDF downloads, and there's a link to a UK website that can turn them into printed books for around £5 if that's what you prefer. gentlesailing.com. About a dozen books there, including guides to the Caribbean and crossing the Pacific. Fair winds.